अज्ञानान्तर्गहनपतितान् आत्मविद्योपदेशैः त्रातुं लोकान् भवदवशिखा तापपापच्यमानान् त्यक्त्वा मौनं वटविटपिनो मूलतो निष्पतन्ति शम्भोर्मूर्तिश्चरति भुवने Shankaracharya. Namaste. Welcome everybody. The very famous debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra. The debate between a staunch Advaita Vedantin and a very staunch Purvamimamsaka. This debate, this episode, occurs in many hagiographies of Shankaracharya, and there are many, many hagiographies of Shankaracharya. So I will primarily rely on the Mādhavīya-Śaṅkara-Digvijaya and the Chidvilasiya to an extent in this discussion. At the outset, I want to say that I will be sidestepping questions of historical accuracy of this episode. My approach to texts is usually academic, especially if the text is abstract philosophy. But this text is not that. I personally believe that history is not the correct lens through which we must read this type of work, because the purpose of these hagiographies is not historical accuracy in the way that we understand today. I like what Sri Aurobindo said in this context, in the context of the category of itihasa in India. He said that itihasa encompasses the historic and the ahistoric together. He wrote, the poets who wrote and those who added to these great bodies of poetic writing wrote with a sense of their function as architects and sculptors of life. So any literary account of any thinker of India assumes the form of a living commentary on the truths that he verbalized, that he preached in his works. So these hagiographies, they try to show that the truth claimed by the Acharya was lived, embodied, and realized by him. They try to show that his life reflected the truths that he taught. So they establish the connection between knowledge and way of living. The two must go hand in hand. This is very important. So these hagiographies function as a narrative commentary of a philosophical position. It is this that is highlighted in the text. It is this that must be reflected upon when we read the hagiographies. So questions like, did this incident truly occur? Did it occur in the way that it is described? There are many variations of the story in different hagiographies. So which one is correct? So these questions are truly irrelevant. So I'll sidestep them entirely. My point is simply this. These hagiographies serve a purpose, even if they are not necessarily based on historical evidence in the modern sense of the term. That is all. With this as an introduction, we can look directly into the text. The Mādhavīya-Śaṅkara-Digvijaya is dated between 1650 to 1800 CE. At the end of each of its chapters, its colophon reads, Iti Shri Mādhavīya. So the author of this work is a Mādhavācharya. While many believe that this is the same Mādhavācharya who later became the famous monk Vidyaranya, this claim is not established. It is disputed. There are many reasons to contest this claim. Be that as it may, the author of this work is a Mādhavācharya. The author refers to his work as Saṅkshepa Shankara Vijaya. And in his Mangalacharana, he writes, Pranamya Paramatmanam Shri Vidyatirtha Rupinam Prachina Shankara Jaye Sarah Sangrahyate Sphutam. So this text essentially brings together skillfully material from several earlier hagiographies. Prachina Shankara Jaye Sarah Sangrahyate Sphutam. It's a late work, 17th, 18th century, far removed from Shankaracharya. So it is necessarily has to cull material from different hagiographies, from earlier hagiographies. It weaves these together in a beautiful narrative. Primarily, it chronicles Shankaracharya's Digvijaya. Now, Digvijaya is originally a term for imperial military conquest or expansion. Literally, it means a conquest of the 8 directions, the 8 quarters, Disham Vijaya. So, a conquest of the world. Shankaracharya's Digvijaya is, of course, not a military conquest. It is an intellectual conquest of the different regions of India. It's not a conquest by battle, but by debate, by words, not swords, by Shastra. So, this episode of his debate with Mandana Mishra occurs in the 8th sarga of this text. We can look into the details. The scene unfolds like this. Shankaracharya had written his Bhashya on the Brahma Sutras, and he wished that one of the greatest scholars of the time, Kumarilabhatta, write a Vartika, a gloss for his Bhashya. So, to make this request of him, Shankaracharya reaches Prayag to meet Kumarilabhatta to request him to write a Vartika on his Bhashya. Shankaracharya's meeting with Kumarilabhatta is described very beautifully. I'll read out the excerpts. Shrutvetitam satvaramesha gachan vyalokayattam tusharashi samstham prabhakaradhyaihi prathita prabhavaihi upasthitam sashrumukhairvineyaihi dhūmayamanena tushanalena sandahyamanepi vapushya sheshe sandrishyamaneena mukhena bashpa parita padma shriyamadadhanam. A terrifying picture is painted here. Kumarilabhatta is seated on Tusharashi. Tusha means chaff or husk, the chaff of rice or grain. Dry husk, dry chaff is collected, made into a pile, and set on fire. This was a form of capital punishment meted out to hardened criminals. Dry straw was twisted around the limbs of the criminal and it was set on fire so that he burns a very slow, a very torturous death. And here we have Kumarilabhatta seated on burning Tusharashi, Vyalokayattam Tusharashi Samstham. He is surrounded by his illustrious disciples like Prabhakara Mishra, who are watching their teacher die a very slow and a very painful death, with tears streaming down their eyes. Prabhakaradhyaihi prathita prabhavaihi upasthitam sashrumukhairvineyaihi. Now the fire has already engulfed the lower half of Kumarila's body. Yet, amidst that smoke, amidst that fire that has engulfed him, only his face is seen, radiant, fresh, like a lotus blooming in the mist. Parita Padma Shriyamadadhan. The Kumarilabhatta that Shankaracharya met was himself fire. Dadarsha Bhatto Jvaladagnikalpaha Jugopayo Veda Patham Jitarihi. Now, why was Kumarilabhatta subjecting himself to capital punishment? For prayashchitta, for atonement, for the expiation of 3 sins that he committed. Kumarila discusses the 3 sins in quite some detail in the text, but in the interest of time, I'll take only one of it. If you watched G.V. Iyer's Sanskrit movie on Shankaracharya, you will know the story because the movie followed this text very closely, Mādhavīya-Śaṅkara-Digvijaya. It made a lot of effort to avoid any deviations from this story. So if you've watched the movie, you know the story, but I'll still read some excerpts from the text. So what is this sin that Kumarila has committed? He explains. Tathāgatā-krantam abhūda-shesham savaidikoddhā viralī-babhūva parīkṣyateshāṃ vijayāya mārkam prāvarti-santrātu manāh puranam. Witnessing Buddhism spreading very quickly, conquering every corner, Tathāgatā-krantam abhūda-shesham. Tathāgata is Buddha. So Tathāgataihi akrantam ashesham sarvam. And witnessing the dwindling number of Vaidikas, Savaidikoddha virali babhuva. Witnessing this, Kumarilabhatta wanted to re-establish the Puranam Vedamarkam. pravarti santratu manah puranam. But unfortunately, he was unable to win any philosophical debate with the Buddhists. He lost every debate with them repeatedly, continuously, primarily because he was unfamiliar with their philosophy. Tadiya siddhanta rahasya vardhin. So he decided to disguise himself as a Buddhist, enter their monastery, and learn Buddhism formally so that ultimately he can defeat them in philosophical debates and re-establish the primacy of the Vedas. Now, while in disguise in the Buddhist monastery, he had to constantly listen to the Vedas being criticized, being severely abused by the Buddhist monks. Adudushadvaidikameva margam. And this for him was torturous. Unable to bear the pain, his eyes shed involuntary tears. The text says, Tada patan me sahasashrubindu. And these tears, they gave him away. The Buddhist monks realized that Kumarilabhatta is not a true Buddhist because a true Buddhist will not shed tears for the Vedas. As a punishment for his deceit, they, the Ahimsavadins, decided to throw him off a cliff. The text reads, Avyapatayan ucchatarate pramattam mam agrasaudhat. So the monks caught him, dragged him to the top of the cliff, and together they literally threw him off the cliff, literally pushed him to his death. Or so they thought. Because at this moment, when he was thrown off the cliff, while he was falling to his death, literally to hit rock bottom, Kumarila shouted, If the Vedas are true, let no harm befall me. Yadi pramanam shrutayo bhavanti, jiveyamasmin patito samasthale. And he lived. He remained unharmed. The fall from one of the tallest cliffs did not break his bones, not a single scratch on his body, because he had vowed, Yadi pramanam shrutayo bhavanti, jiveyamasmin patito samasthale. And this is why Kumarila is performing a prayashchitta. Because he said, Yadi pramanam shrutayo bhavanti. If the Vedas are true, let no harm befall me. The use of the word if, yadi hasandeha padaprayogat. The word if expresses a doubt. It is a sandeha pada. Kumarila used a sandeha pada for the Vedas, almost casting aspersions on its validity. He should have said, may the true Vedas protect me. No, he said, if the Vedas are true, let no harm befall me. And this, for him, is an unforgivable transgression. And to atone for this sin, he is on that Tusharashi, slow burning to his death. If this seems, I don't know, outrageous or a disproportionate punishment for what may be a minor transgression, if that, we would do well to remember that our ancestors have faced far worse conditions to safeguard the Vedas, to have protected the Vedas, to have passed on the Vedas for at least a couple of 1,000 years without any errors in transmission. They have given their life for it. And this here is a small illustration of that level of dedication, that level of faith, the absolute surrender to the Vedas that has protected this country. Anyway, coming back to the story, Kumarila, because he is himself unable to fulfill Shankaracharya's request, he's unable to write a Vartika for his Bhashya, he directs him to his disciple, Mandana Mishra. Now, Mandana Mishra was admittedly the greatest Purvamimamsaka of his times. Sudhishcha Mandana Mishra Sharma, Digantas Vishranta Yasha Vijayo. Kumarila says, Sarvasu Shastra Saranishu Sa Vishwarupaha Mattodhikaha Priyatamascha madashrameshu. Mandana is better than I am. Mattaha adhikaha. This is a teacher admitting openly that his disciple is better than he is in his own discipline. So Kumarila tells Shankaracharya, you win him in an argument. You win Mandana Mishra, you have won everybody. Yasmin jite sarvamidam jitam syat. And when you have defeated him in Shastrartha, he will write that Vartika for your Bhashya. So Shankaracharya stayed with Kumarilabhatta until his end and then left to Mahishmati to meet Mandana Mishra. According to the Mādhavīya and the Vyasācaliya Śaṅkara-Vijaya, Mandana Mishra lives in Mahishmati. According to the Chidvilasiya, he lived in Kashmir. The details of the Kumarila episode is also slightly different in the Chidvilasiya. Be that as it may. At Mahishmati, Shankaracharya had no trouble finding Mandana Mishra's house. The text reads like this. Swatah pramana paratah pramanam kirangana yatra giram giranti dvarasthanidam tarasaniruddha jani hitan mandana panditaukaha. Kirangana are birds like parrots. So where parrots are debating the Swatah Pramanyata of the Vedas at the entrance of the house, know that house to be Mandana Mishra's. Phalapradam karma phalapradojaha kirangana yatra giram giranti dvarasthanidam tarasaniruddha jani hitan mandana panditaukaha. Where parrots are debating if karma yields phala directly or requires the intervention of Ishvara, know that house to be Mandana Mishra's. Jagad dhruvam syat, jagad adhruvam syat, kirangana yatra giram giranti, dvarasthanidam tarasaniruddha, jani hitan mandana panditaukaha. Where parrots are debating if the world is eternal or non-eternal. Jagad dhruvam syate, jagad adhruvam syate. Know that house to be Mandana Mishra's. So Shankaracharya arrived at Mandana Mishra's doorstep. Mandana Mishra, for his part, is not very pleased to receive Shankaracharya, primarily because at that moment he was engaged in performing a Shraddha ceremony. And for him, an auspicious time like that, the sight of a shaven-headed sannyasi is inauspicious. So their very first exchange is very unpleasant. Mandana is irritable, Shankaracharya is amused, and a very witty conversation follows. So Mandana says, Kutah Mundi, where did you come from, you shaven-headed fellow? Shankaracharya playfully twists the meaning of these words. He takes Kutaha Mundi to mean Kim Paryantam Bhavan Mundi. How far is your head shaven? It's a play of words, it's punny. So Shankaracharya humorously replies to this, I'm shaven up to the neck, Agalat, Galaparyantam Mundi. And irate Mandana says, that is not what I asked. I asked you where you have come from. I asked your way. Panthaste prichyate maya. And Shankaracharya playfully twists the words again. He says, you asked the way. What did the way say? Kimaha pantaha. Now, an angry Mandana replies, it said that your mother is a widow. Tvan mata mundetyaha. And Shankaracharya says, Tathaivahi. It must be true. Your mother must be a widow. Mandana is getting angrier by the minute. He says, are you drunk? Aho pita kimusura. And Shankaracharya very annoyingly takes the word pita to mean yellow and takes the question to mean, is toddy yellow in color? And so he replies, no, it's white in color. Naiva shveta. The banter continues like this and the conversation turns very personal, very bitter. Mandana says, you fake sannyasi. For you, sannyasa is simply loafing around with a bundle of books and a band of disciples. For you, sannyasa is simply the inability to feed your family, the inability to shoulder your responsibilities. Tyaktva apanigrhitim svam Ashaktya Parirakshane Shishya Pustaka Bhare Chor Vyakhyata Brahmanishtata. To the Shankaracharya says, what about you? For you, Grihastha is simply becoming a servant of a woman. It is your incapacity to remain celibate. Striyaha shushrushamanasya vyakhyata karmanishtata. Mandana says, where is sannyasa in this Kali Yuga? You have taken the garb of a sannyasi because of your desire to eat good food without having to work for it. Svadvanna bhakshakamena veshoyam yoginam dhritaha. So this Shankaracharya says, what is Agnihotra in this Kali Yuga? You have just taken the garb of a ritualist because of your desire for women. Kvasvargaha, kvaduracharaha, vagnihotram kvavakalihi. Manye maithuna kamena veshoyam karminam dhritaha. So the war of word continues between the two. Mandana Mishra entirely losing his cool, getting angrier and angrier by the minute, seeing red. Shankaracharya, on the other hand, is calm, is cool, very humorous, and very annoying. Finally, Shankaracharya says, enough of this meaningless banter. I did not come here for bhiksha. I came here for Vada Bhiksha. Vada Bhiksha Michan Bhavat Sannidham Agatosmi. And my only condition of this debate, this Vada, is that the one who loses must accept the philosophy of the other and become his disciple. Sa Anyonya Shishyatva Pana Pradeya. Mandana Mishra, for his part, is very happy to hear this. He's happy to accept a challenge. So he replies, I will not hesitate to accept a challenge, a Vada Bhiksha, even if Adishesha, the summit of learning himself, challenges me with his 1,000 tongues. Api sahasramukhe phaninamake na vijitastvite jato phanatyayam. The Bhavartha is to tum kis khet ki muli ho. So the two agree to a debate. Together, they set the rules for the debate. Vadehi, Vadi Prativadinau Dvau. In a debate, there should be two parties meeting in an argument, and we are the two parties. Vipaksha Paksha Grahanam Vidhattaha. There must be a proposition for which or against which the arguments are directed. Paksha and Vipaksha. Kano Pratignya Vadatoscha Tasyam. It has to be fixed how success or defeat is to be determined and what the consequence of such success or defeat should be. And kaha parshnikaha, that's also the question of who the judge should be for the debate. So let us fix these beforehand so we can start the debate in the best of spirits with a smile on our faces. And this is what they did. They decided to start the debate early next morning. They decided that Ubhaya Bharati, Mandana Mishra's wife, will be the judge for the debate. In this text, Ubhaya Bharati is understood as the incarnation of goddess Saraswati herself, cursed by sage Durvasa to take a human birth. So she is to be the judge. And so everything is decided, everything is set, everything is fixed. At dawn, at sunrise, Shankaracharya, having completed his ablutions with his disciples, reached Mandana's house, where several learned scholars had already assembled to watch the debate. Furthermore, Brahma and the Devatas had assembled to witness this historic moment, and Ubhaya Bharati adorned the seat of judgment like goddess Saraswati herself. At the outset, Shankaracharya stated his siddhanta, his pratigna, his position. Brahmaikam paramartha satchidamalam vishva prapanchatmana shukti rupya paratmaneva bahala jnana vrutam bhasate tadjnanan nikhila prapancha nilaya svatma vyavastha param nirvanam janimuktam abhyupagatam manam shruter mastakam. Brahman, the absolute, is the only truth. It is only because of avidya, ignorance, that Brahman appears as the world of multiplicity, like shell, shukti, that appears as silver. When illusion is dispelled, it is realized that silver is just the shell. Similarly, when ignorance is erased, it is realized that the world is simply Brahman, which is the same as one's own Atman. This is supreme knowledge. This is moksha. It brings about the cessation of samsara. And the pramana of this is the Vedanta, the Upanishads, the crown of the Vedas. Further, Shankaracharya says, Badham jaye yadi parajaya bhagaham syam sanyasamangam parihritya kashaya chelam. Badham jaye, I'm sure that I will win this debate, but Yadi parajaya bhagaham syam, if I lose, then sanyasamangam parihritya kashaya chelan, I will abandon my kavi, my ochre robes. I will give up sannyasa and embrace grihasthashrama. Let Ubhaya Bharati be the judge of this and the witness to my pratigna. Mandana, in his turn, made his pratigna. He outlined his position at the outset. He says, Vedanta na pramanam chitivapumshi pade tatra sangatya yogat purvo bhagah pramanam padachaya gamite karya vastunya sheshe shabdanam karya matram prati samadhigata shaktirabhyunnatanam karmabhyo muktirishta tadiha tanubhritam ayushah syat samaptehe. Vedanta is not pramana. Vedanta cannot be a pramana for Brahman because Vedanta is constituted of words, and words cannot reveal an entity that is unoriginated, that is infinite. Words can only reveal objects which are originated entities. They cannot reveal pure subject, pure objectless consciousness. No, Vedanta is not a pramana for Brahman. Vedanta na pramanam chitivapumshi pade tatra sangatya yogate. So what then is Shabda Pramana? How is Veda a pramana? It is the non-Vedanta part of the Vedas, that is the true Shabda Pramana, is Mandana's argument. Purvo bhagaha pramanam. And this portion of the Vedas deal with karma, with yajna. So yajna, karma is the stepping stone to moksha. Karma bhyo muktirishta. And we embodied beings must perform Veda Vihita karma as long as we are alive. And this is my position. This is my Siddhanta. Further, Mandana takes the pratigna, Vade kritesmin yadime jayanyaha, Vayoditat syat viparita bhavaha, Yeyam tvaya bhut katita prasakshe, Janati chetsa bhavita vadhurme. If I lose this debate, I will renounce grihasthashrama. I will take sannyasa. I will be your disciple. Let Ubhaya Bharati be the judge of this and the witness of my pratigna. Ubhaya Bharati then put two wreaths, two garlands across the necks of Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra. And she declared that whosoever wreath, garland, withers, that person will be understood as defeated. She makes this alternate arrangement and then proceeds to fulfill her household duties. Because she has to cook, she has to clean. She cannot be physically present for the entire length of the debate. So she makes this alternative arrangement so that her physical absence is of no real consequence. The wreaths across their necks will demonstrate the winner of the debate. And so began the historic debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra that lasted for days, for months, both great scholars, both quoting authority after authority. We look at the details of the debate, the topics that were discussed, the arguments that were put forward. Very broadly, we can delineate 5 important topics that were debated. First, the purpose of the Vedas. What is the purpose of the Vedas? Is it to enjoin yajna or is it to reveal Brahman? Second, how do we interpret the Mahavakya Tattvamasi? Is it meant as praise, as stuti? Or is it upasana? Is it meditation? Or does it declare the similarity between Jiva and Brahman? How do we interpret or understand this Mahavakya? Third, how do we explain or explain away the contradiction between perception and the declaration of Jiva Brahmaikya? Because Pratyaksha and Anumana stand in stark contrast to what is declared in the Vedas. So, how do we reconcile the two? Fourth, how do we understand the Vedic statements that teach difference between Jiva and Brahman? How do we reconcile such statements with the statements that teach Jiva Brahmaikya? 5, what is the uniqueness of Shruti Pramana? How is it so important? So these very broadly are the issues that are discussed, that are debated, and these are very, very important issues. They are core philosophical topics for both Mimamsa and Vedanta. So we can learn a lot about both these philosophies through the details of this debate. So we will look into it now. Mandana Mishra opens the debate with an objection to Shankaracharya's Siddhanta, declared by him in his opening statements. So he says, Bho bho yatikshmadhipate bhavatpihe jiveshvarayor vastavamaika vishuddhamangi kriyate hi tatra pramanamevam navayam pratimaha. Bho yatikshmadhipate, O Supreme Sannyasi, you categorically maintain that the Jiva is identical to Brahman. Jiveshayor vastavam aikarupyam vishuddham yad bhavadbhihe angikritam or angikriyate. For this, I find no valid proof, no pramana. Tatra pramanam vayam na pratimaha, na janimaha. Tatra pramanam nasti ityarthaha. To this Shankaracharya says, Sapratyavadi ridameva manam yachvetaketu prabukhan vineyan uttalakadya guravo mahantaha sangrahayantyatmataya paresham. The pramana for Jiveshwara Aikya or Jiva Brahmaikya are the declarations of the Upanishads, the statements like Tattvamasi, that great sages like Uddalaka taught their worthy disciples like Shvetaketu. Statements like Tadatmanameva Vedaham Brahmasmiti. Statements like Tatrako Mohaha Kahshokaha Ekatvam Anupashyataha. So Shruti Pramana is the ultimate Pramana for Jiva Brahmaikya Vada. This is Shankaracharya's argument. See, the role of Shruti in the system of Purvamimamsa is very well known. Purvamimamsa is often described as the scholastic tradition dedicated to the study of the Vedas, to the interpretation of the Vedas. So for Purvamimamsa, Shruti is everything. But Vedic authority in the system of Advaita Vedanta, on the other hand, in Shankaracharya's philosophy, is not very well known. Modern scholarship on Shankaracharya, represented by scholars such as S. Radhakrishnan, S. Dasgupta, T.M.P. Mahadevan, M. Hiriyanna, Ninian Smart, Karl Potter, Elliot Dush, S. Maeda, then you have Sachidananda Murthy, Devaraj, etc. They accord primacy of Anubhava, direct experience, over Shruti Pramana. They argue that the truth claims of Advaita are based on direct experience rather than on revelation, that the declarations of Shruti need to be verified, confirmed by the knowledge gained through direct experience. So the authority of Shruti is only secondary. The emphasis on Anubhava, on direct experience, has resulted in the downgrading of Shruti Pramana, the acceptance of Shruti Pramana. I'm certainly not contesting the primacy of Anubhava Pramana here, but I'm saying that Shruti Pramana is extremely significant in Advaita Vedanta, extremely significant in Shankaracharya's writings, and it cannot be brushed aside as faith or theology or faith-based revelation. It is not that. See, any pramana must satisfy two conditions in order for it to be a pramana. A, it must inform us of something which cannot be ascertained by any other pramana. And B, its claims must not be contradicted by any other valid source. So, one is novelty, anadhigatatvam, and second is non-contradictedness, the abadhitatvam. These two are considered as the crucial characteristics of valid sources of knowledge, and Vedas fulfill both criteria. According to Shankaracharya, two categories of knowledge inaccessible to all other pramanas, available only through the Vedas, are dharma and Brahman. The knowledge of dharma and adharma, the knowledge of the relationship between the performance and non-performance of prescribed ritual actions and their unseen results which they produce. This is derived from the Karmakanda section of the Vedas. This cannot be known by any other pramana, and this is what Purvamimamsa deals with. The Jnana Kanda or the Upanishads, on the other hand, they reveal the knowledge of Brahman, the absolute. Technically, there is no other instrument to know Brahman. Anubhava is not a pramana in the technical sense of the term. It's not an instrument to know Brahman. It is Brahman. It is the experience of Brahman. It is what it is. It is not technically a pramana. So if we have to admit of a pramana to know Brahman, again, this is only an adhyaropa. Brahman does not need a pramana. But that's okay. If we must admit to a pramana, then the Vedas are the only pramana for Brahman. There is no other pramana for Brahman. Now, this position raises a few questions. How is an entity like Brahman to be known by words of the Vedas? Can words be a logical source of knowledge for such a reality? How can the subject, the knower, that can never be objectified, how can it be known through words? Mandana Mishra, in his opening statements, raises this exact question. He says, Chitti Vapumshi, that is Chitsvarupe Pade, Paramatmani, Vedantaha Pramanam na bhavanti. Tatra chidrupe siddhe vastuni karyanvite sangate shaktehe ayogat. So Shankaracharya argues like this. The case for the adequacy of the words of Upanishads to reveal Brahman is based on the argument that these words are not required to create Brahman or to even prove the existence of Brahman. Words alone cannot bring a non-existent entity into existence. And in this case, they are not required to do so. So the problem does not involve knowledge of an entirely unknown, unrevealed, or remote Brahman. The problem is of incomplete and erroneous knowledge of an ever available, ever attained entity. The function of words of the Upanishads lies primarily in the negation of attributes imposed through ignorance upon Brahman. The Upanishads do not reveal an unknown being, they impart correct knowledge about a self that is immediately available but whose nature is misunderstood. So Shankaracharya writes in his Sutra Bhashya, he says, Iti chaivamadhyaha shrutayaha moksha pratibandha nivritti matrameva atmajnanasya phalam darshayanti. So the challenge is of understanding what is already available. This argument is the basis for Shankaracharya's important distinction between karma and jnana, between action and knowledge. Action is the correct and appropriate solution, where the problem involved is the accomplishment of something not accomplished, something unaccomplished. Knowledge, on the other hand, is adequate for the accomplishment of the already accomplished. Svatma bhuta brahma praptireva Parama Purushartha, this is the line from Brahmasūtrabhāṣya, tat praptischa mithyajnana vyavadhana nibarhana dvara. So in opposition to Mandana Mishra's statements, who contended that Vedantana Pramanam, Purvo Bhagaha Pramanam, in opposition to this position, Shankaracharya argued for the independent authority of the Upanishads. So this is what Shankaracharya has stated here. He says that the pramana for Jiva Brahmaikya is Vedanta Vakya. Idameva pramanam yat Shvetaketu prabhritin chishyan uddalakadya mahanto guravaha paresham paramatmanam atmataya grahayanti tattvamasi Shvetaketu iti. Now in response to this, Mandana Mishra raises an objection. He says, Veda avasaneshu hi tattvamadi vachamsi japtan nyaghamarşanani. Mandana argues that statements like tattvamasi do not convey any direct meaning. They are simply aghamarşanani. Agha means sin. So in order to rid oneself of sins, statements like tattvamasi may be repeated, but they do not convey anything outside of that. So Mandana's argument is based on the Purvamimamsa position that the pramanatva of the Vedas is limited only to the Chodana sentences. It is only the Chodana Vakyas of the Veda that function as an instrument to know Brahman. Here Chodana is defined as Chodanahi kriyayaha pravartakam vachanam ahuhu. So Chodana is that sentence of the Vedas which incites a person to act, to perform an action, to perform a yajna. So Chodana comes from the root Chudu Sanchodane. Samchodhanam literally is preranayam, pravartanayam cha. So incitement to act. So according to this system of Purvamimamsa, dharma is conveyed by the Vedic injunctions. So whatever is not an injunction does not convey dharma and accordingly has no independent epistemological value. Mandana Mishra in his Brahmasiddhi, his actual text, he says, Yena Vedartha Matrasya Dharmatvam Ma Bhuditi Chodana iti Abochat. I think this is Bhava Viveka. I don't think this is Brahmasiddhi. I have to confirm that, but this is his vakya. Yena Vedartha Matrasya Dharmatvam Ma Bhuditi Chodana iti Avochat. Through this word Chodana, it is pointed out that the injunctive part of the Veda is not tantamount to the whole of the Veda. The whole of the Veda is not a pramana of dharma. It is only the injunctive sentences, the sentences which enjoin actions. Only these sentences are instruments to know dharma. The rest of the Vedic corpus is relegated to a secondary role. What is not Chodana is Arthavada. These sentences do not yield knowledge of dharma directly. They are classified as explanatory material or matter. They have an ancillary role. They only participate in the larger purpose by supporting the Chodana Vakyas. They do not yield any meaning independently. Now, there are several reasons why the system of Purvamimamsa accepts only the pramanatva of the Chodana Vakyas and not the entire corpus of the Vedas. One reason is that it is not possible to offer rational explications for the entire Vedas. The entire Vedas is not strictly rational. This does not mean that it is irrational or that it is nonsensical. It is simply that it is beyond reason. It is supra-rational. You cannot offer rational explications for it. The Mimamsakas strictly worked within the limits of reason. So they set aside the rest of the Vedas as Arthavada. They avoided, sidestepped the debate on the rationality of the Vedas because the irrational and the supra-rational appear to be very similar. It's very easy to confuse one for another. So the easier way out is to sidestep it, to put it aside, to bring back the attention, the focus to what matters. And what matters for the Purvamimamsaka is the performance of the yajna. So statements like Tattvamasi are Arthavada for the Purvamimamsaka and therefore not of great importance. This is Mandana's argument. So he says, Apatatas Tattvamasiti Vakyat Atisha Jiveshvarayor Abhedaha pratiyate thapi mukhadikartre prashansaya syat vidhishesha eva. He says statements like Tattvamasi are the vidhisheshas. They occur after the injunctions as an afterthought to the Chodana Vakyas. They are not injunctions in themselves. They are allied to the Chodana Vakyas in a subsequent sense. Here, specifically in the case of Tattvamasi, this statement seems to be a stuti, a praise of the Yajamana, the performer of the Vedic Yajna. He is praised for his highly meritorious deed of performing the sacrifice. So he is praised as Ishvara himself. There is no greater meaning that can be derived from this sentence, is Mandana's argument. This is very much justified from the standpoint of the Purvamimamsa. Kratvangayupadi kamariyamadi devatmana vakya ganah prashansan sheshah kriya kandagato yadi syat kandantarasthopi bhavet katham saha. He says, what you call vidhi sheshas, they occur in the Purva Bhaga of the Vedas, in the Karma Kanda, and they are admittedly closely related to the performance of the ritual. For example, statements like Aditya Yupa or Yajamanaha Prastaraha. This type of statements, this type of Vakya Ganaha, they may be considered as eulogies. They may be understood as eulogies, but Tattvamasi, it occurs in an entirely different context, in an entirely different section of the Vedas. Kandantare jnana kande sthitaha vidisheshaha katham bhavet. On what basis can it be dragged into the ritual and made a shesha of the vidhis, of that ritual? This argument is entirely based on Shankaracharya's Brahmasūtrabhāṣya, the commentary on the third sutra of the Brahmasūtrabhāṣya. It reads like this. I'll just read it out. Here the Mimamsaka is saying, Katham punar brahmanaha shastra pramanakatvam uchyate yavata amnayasya kriyarthatvad anarthakyam atadarthanam iti kriyaparatvam shastrasya pradarshitam ato vedantanam anarthakyam akriyarthatvat kartra devatadi prakashanarthatvena va kriya vidhisheshatvam upasanadi kriyantara vidhinarthatvam va. I think it's amazing how beautifully the very subtle, very abstract arguments of the Brahma Sutra is woven into the story. How the abstract philosophical details reach the common man. It is in details like this that texts like this become so important, not in their historical accuracy. Because a common man might not read Brahmasūtrabhāṣya, but he may learn about it through other means, through texts like these. So to this, Mandana says, all right, if it is not a vidhi shesha, then maybe we can consider it as a vidhi, an injunction. Maybe Tattvamasi can be interpreted as an injunction, as a vidhi to meditate on Brahman, similar to the injunction Shrotavyo Mantavyo Nidhityasitavyaha. So Tattvamasi can be interpreted similarly as a jnana vidhi. So he says, Tarhyastu jive paramatma drishti vidhayakah karma samruddhayerhan abrahmani brahma dhiyam vidhatte yatha manonnarka nabhasvadadav. Now, this is a big debate in itself. There are two issues that are involved in this. First, what is the role of upasana in moksha? Does it contribute in some way to the attainment of moksha? And two is shrotavyo mantavyo nidhityasitavyaha, vidhi vakya. It is an injunction. If it is, then does it help in the attainment of moksha? First, what is the role of upasana and karma in moksha? Is Tattvamasi an injunction to meditate on Brahman? So Shankaracharya's answer to this question is very clear, and the answer is no. Karma does not contribute to the attainment of moksha. Shankaracharya is very clear. There's absolutely no role of karma in the attainment of moksha. This argument is very nicely captured in the Brahmasūtrabhāṣya on the Sutra Tattva Samanvayat. It's an argument between a Purvamimamsaka and Shankaracharya. I'll just read out some excerpts of it. This is what is echoed in the Mādhavīya-Śaṅkara-Digvijaya. So the argument goes like this. In this sutra, the Purva Pakshi raises the exact same objection that Mandana Mishra has raised. He says, the Veda Vakyas don't convey an injunction, then it serves no purpose. It is useless. To the Shankaracharya says, no, there is a purpose that it serves. Nanu vastumatra kathanepi rajuriyam nayam sarpaha ityado bhranti janita bhiti nivartanenarthavatvam drishtam. तथेहापि असंसार्यात्म वस्तु कथनेन संसारित्व भ्रांति निवर्तनेन अर्थवत्वं स्यात्. A statement that merely declares that this is a rope, not a snake. This statement serves a purpose. It removes the fear that you felt when you assumed this object to be a snake. So this statement is certainly not purposeless or meaningless. Similarly, Vedanta Vakya that declares that you are free, you are eternally free. This, that you're not bound to samsara, how can this be meaningless? It frees you. It serves a purpose. It serves the purpose of removing ignorance. So for this, the Purva Pakshi says, the Mimamsaka, he replies, Syatetadevam yadi rajjusvarupa shravanamatreeneva sarpa bhrantihi samsaritva bhranti brahmasvarupa shravanamatrena nivarteta natu nivartate shruta brahmanopi yatha purvam sukha dukkhadi samsari dharma darshana. The Purva Pakshi says, correct, what you say would be true if ignorance was indeed removed upon hearing about the nature of Brahman. Yadi samsaritva bhranti brahmasvarupa shravanamatrena nivarteta. Natu nivartate. No, but that does not happen. Shruta brahmanopi yatha purvam sukha dukkhadi samsari dharma darshanat. Even after having heard about Brahman, I hear aham brahmasmi, but yet we continue to be bound to samsara yatha purvam as before. Shrotavyo mantavyo nididhyasitavyaha iti cha shravanottara kalayor manana nididhyasanayor vidhi darshanat. So the Purva Pakshi says the Vedas prescribe action even in this case after Shravana of the nature of Brahman. Manana and Nididhyasana are enjoined. What changes with the knowledge of Brahman? Nothing changes. So clearly, action plays a role in the attainment of moksha. To this, Shankaracharya offers a very protracted argument, the gist of which is simply this. We aren't talking about knowledge that is simply information. Information about Brahman is, of course, not equal to knowing Brahman. The point can be illustrated like this. If I'm told a joke now and I get it after 10 minutes and then I break out into a laugh, then when did I really hear the joke? When I first heard it or when I understood it, when I got it. So according to Shankaracharya, merely hearing the words is not Shravana. It is that transforming moment when you get it. So there are no injunctions for Brahmajnana. The Shrotavyo, Mantavyo, etc. are not vidhis. In his Sutra Bhashya, Shankaracharya says, Anik vivokili, viditthayani vachanani, svabhavika pravritti vishaya vimukhi karanayani iti brumaha. So these sentences of Shrotavyo, Mantavyo, etc., these serve the purpose of turning the mind away from its natural inclination, the tendency to go outwards, for vimukhi karana of the natural tendency of the mind. This so-called injunction is said, but it is not a literal reading of the text. So in this text, Shankaracharya argues, if your words are true, if Tattvamasi is indeed a vidhi vakya, then it would imply that moksha is a product, an effect of an action, of a karma. Tarhi kriyajanyataya vimuktihi svargadivad anta vinashvarasyad upasana kartum akartum anyatha va kartum arha manasah kriyaiva. If moksha was to be attained by action, then like Svarga, it could also be lost and destroyed. Brahma Vidya is not a product. Brahman, Atman is what it is. The Upanishads merely draw your attention to it. Whether you choose to see it or not is an entirely different matter. It is Vastu Tantram Jnanam, not Purusha Tantram. It does not depend on your volition. Kartum, akartum, anyathava kartum, arha, manasaha, kriyaiva. So it's not something to be accomplished by action. It is simply what it is. So, kriyajanyataya vimuktihi svargadivat vinashvara syat. So, tattvamasi cannot be a vidhi vakya. This is Shankaracharya's argument. Now, Mandana Mishra tries a different line of argument. He says, Nanavevamapyaikya paratvamasya pratyakshapurva pramiti prakopat na yujyate tajjapamatra yogi svadhyaya vidyashrita abhyupeyam. The Jiva Brahmaikya that you assert contradicts pratyaksha pramana. I don't see myself as Ishvara. I don't feel I am Ishvara. In fact, aham anishvaraha, he says, jaganyantratva bhavat, dukkhitatvat, kinchidnyatvacha, yadyam aham Ishvaraha syam, tarhi jagat janmadau shaktaha syam, yato na shaktaha, tasmat neshvara. To this, Shankaracharya replies, Pratyaksha is not a pramana for Brahman. In addition to the inherent limitations of the sense organs and the absence of any quality in Brahman that can be apprehended by any of them, there's also the impossibility of objectifying Brahman. The process of empirical knowledge involves a distinction between the subject and object, between the knower and the known. Knowledge of an object presupposes the subject, the knower. But Brahman is the eternal subject. It is eternally a subject. As awareness, it illumines everything, and the entire universe, including the mind, the body, the sense organs, are its objects. Brahman is the light of even the lights. So in his Sutra Bhashya, Shankaracharya says, Yattuktam paninishpannatvat brahmane pramanantarani sambhaveyuriti tadapi manorathamatram रूपाद्यभावात् हि नायमर्थः प्रत्यक्षस्य गोचरः लिङ्गाद्यभावाच्च नानुमानादीनाम् आगममात्र समधिगम्य एव तु ayamर्थो धर्मवत्. So we must note here that Shankaracharya does not deny the validity or the capacity of the pramanas like perception and anumana, inference, to produce valid knowledge in their respective spheres of the empirical world. In fact, he says that practical affairs would become impossible if the pramanas were rendered to be fundamentally useless. It is only in the matter of dharma and Brahman that he says that these pramanas are useless. So Brahman is prior to the sense organs. It is prior to the identification with the body-mind complex. So it cannot be known through any of these instruments. So the text Shankaracharya says, Akshena ched bhedamitas tada syate abhedavadi shrutivakya badha asannikarsha na bhaved bheda pramaivatenasya kuto virodhaha. In order to declare that Jiva and Brahman are different, the sense organs must first make contact with Brahman. There must be sannikarsha between the Indriya and Brahman in order to declare that there is a difference between Brahman and Jiva. Akshasya bhedena asannikarshat bheda pramaiva nahi bhavet. But that is not the case here. The sense organs don't really truly perceive the difference between Jiva and Brahman. They don't truly contradict the Shrutis. Not that it would matter if they did, because their sphere of application is entirely different. But they don't truly contradict Shruti. So to this, Mandana Mishra says, all right, I concede to this. Let us set aside perception. But what of intuition? We don't intuit that we are Brahman. Bhinno hamishaditi bhasatehi bhedasya jivatma visheshanatvam tat sannikarshotvata samprayogat bhavepi bhedendriya yor manishim. To this Shankaracharya says, ati prasakter na kevalasya visheshanattvasya tadabhyupeyam bhedashrayehi indriya sannikrishte na sannikrishtatva mihatmanosti. You say that difference between Jiva and Ishvara is felt, is perceived, is intuited. But what is difference? Difference is a guna. Is it something that can be perceived independently or even intuited independently by any pramana? No, it is a quality. It is an attribute. It is a guna. It is a visheshana, an adjective. How do you propose that it is perceived without the perception of the object that it qualifies? And that is Brahman, which you cannot perceive. So Mandana refines his position. He says, okay, we say that can we say that this difference is inferred then? There are certain qualities that define Ishvara which are entirely absent in the Jiva, absent in us. So therefore we can conclude that the Jiva and Ishvara are different. So this is through inference. This is the other pramana. So Shankaracharya says, no, inference is again based on perception, on pratyaksha. And when perception itself is faulty, then how can inference hold any good? Now, Mandana restarts from an entirely different point. He says, self-knowledge does not eliminate the difference between self and Ishvara any more than it eliminates the difference between self and a pot. He says, Atmajnanena ghatadigata bhedasya abadhyatvat. Knowing myself does not abolish difference between me and the rest of the world. You, on the other hand, claim that self-knowledge leads to abolishment of all differences. So I will be no different from a pot. Does this not sound ridiculous to you? So pratyabadhya vedashrayatvam sadhyam ghatadau cha tadasti yogin tvayatma bodhena bhidana badhyet yena bhyupedeti na kopi doshaha. So this Shankaracharya is saying, what exactly do you mean when you say the self? Do you refer to that self which is unaffected by dualities like pleasure and pain? Or do you mean the individual who is subject to these dualities, to these sufferings? Which is the self that you talk about? Nanu svashabdena sukhadimanva vivakshitastad vidhurothavatma adyesmadashtam natu sadhyamante drishtantahani punareva tesyat. If you refer to the individual, then we are in agreement. There can be no abolishment of differences by the knowledge of this self. I agree with you entirely. If, on the other hand, you refer to knowledge of that self which is unaffected and unaffectable, then yes, knowledge will eliminate differences even between the self and the pot. And unfortunately, there is no illustration to show how this works, because every illustration, every drishtanta belongs to the field of avidya, and the self is beyond avidya. To this Mandana says, well, my point is that you're not prepared to admit that there is such a self which is subject to pleasure and pain, which is different to Ishvara. This self is the Jiva, and it is different from Ishvara. It is different from a pot. Shankaracharya says this is avidya. It is because of avidya, because of adhyasa, that we believe that we are this limited body-mind complex. We believe that we are different from Ishvara, from Brahman. It's because of a fundamental confusion between Atma and Anatma, self and not self, that we mistake the self for the not self and the not self for the self. We mistakenly perceive the qualities of Atma in Anatma and vice versa. This is the play of avidya. So, and the proof of this is Shruti and your Anubhava. Now, Mandana raises a very important question. He says, you conveniently use the Shruti statements that are not contradictory to your assertions. But what of those Upanishadic passages that teach difference, that don't declare Brahma Jiva Brahmaikya? How do you explain those sentences? What do you make of them? So Mandana quotes some relevant examples. He says, Bhodh Vasuparna Sayuja Sakhaye Tyadyash Rutir Bheda Mudirayanti Jiveshayoho Pippala Bhoktra Bhoktros Tayor Abheda Shruti Badhikastu. You have the extremely famous passage of the two birds, Vasuparna, Sayuja Sakhaya, one of which acts and the other watches. So there are two, not one. There's one that is Jiva, the other that is Brahman. The two are different, and this is quoted in the very same portion of the Vedas that you take as a pramana. To this, Shankaracharya says that these statements are simply describing the apparent notions, the wrong notions, not the ultimate truth. This is a very important dimension of Shankaracharya's teachings, the method of Adhyaropa and Apavada. The Vedas, the Gita, the Brahma Sutras employ this method to teach the unteachable Brahman. Adhyaropa and Apavada describe a combined process of deliberated pedagogical superimpositions of attributes, Adhyaropa, followed by their retraction, negation, elimination, Apavada. The first step, Adhyaropa, is deliberately framed by the instructional process in order to remove the natural superimpositions that is founded in ignorance. So every pedagogical superimposition is effective in as much as it undertakes the removal of natural superimpositions. The second step, Apavada, it prompts the removal of even these deliberated superimpositions so as to avoid its ultimate reification. See, the method is like this. Imaginary characteristics are attributed to Atman. This is Adhyaropa, and it serves to negate whatever is incompatible with it. Later, even these falsely attributed characteristics are negated. This is Apavada. So here, see, when you read it according to this method, then there are absolutely no contradictions in the Shruti Vakyas. So in this particular passage of Vasuparna, Shankaracharya writes that by mentioning a difference between the Bhoktri and the Sakshin, the Vedas merely point to the fact that the Sakshin is absolutely untouched by any actions. The Sakshin is not the doer of actions, not the enjoyer of fruits. So this separation between the doer, enjoyer, and the witness is not absolute. It is imaginary. It is Adhyaropa. It is a pedagogical tool. It simply serves a pedagogical purpose, and it serves to teach the absolute unblemished nature of the witness. That is all. This Adhyaropa is later negated in a later part of the text, and that is Apavada. So the imaginary separation teaches or serves to teach the nature of the witness. So the attention must be focused on the description of the nature of the witness, not on the separation between the jiva and the witness. So this is how Shruti is to be read, and this is what Shankaracharya teaches. Further, he says, Pratyaksha siddhe vifale paratma bheder shrutirano nayavit pramanam. Difference between Jiva and Ishvara is Pratyaksha Siddha. You don't need Shruti to tell us that we are what we already know. The Pramanatva of Shruti lies in pointing what is not obvious to us. And this is what is the Jiva Brahmaikya. Prabalyam apadayati Shrutinam Manantaram naiva Buddhagrayayan Gatartha tadanum amukhena tasam daurbalya sampadakam eva kintu. If Shruti simply confirms what is already confirmed by Pratyaksha, and if it derives its validity from this, then this defeats the Swatah Pramanyata of the Vedas that you yourself so vigorously uphold. See, for the Mimamsakas, Swatah Pramanyata, the theory of intrinsic validity of the Vedas, is extremely important. This is the basic epistemological position of the Mimamsakas, that all cognitions must be accepted as true unless and until they are falsified by other cognitions. So, what is the implication of the Swatah Pramanyata theory? With regard to the Veda, the self-validity theory amounts to saying that the Veda is valid in and of itself until proven to be wrong or false by another valid source. But since its sphere of application is dharma and Brahman, and this cannot be known by human perception because it is not accessible to other human means of knowledge. So Veda can never be falsified. It is always fully valid. This is the Swatah Pramanyata theory. And this is a core Mimamsa theory, and Mandana's arguments threatened to cut at its root. So at the end of this, Mandana simply accepted his defeat. Ityadya dhridayuktirasya shrushruਭेद दत्तानुमोदा गिराम देव्या तादृश विश्वरूप रभसावष्टंभ मुष्टिंधया भर्तृन्यास विलक्ष्य सूक्ति जननी साक्षित्व कुक्षिंभरिः सश्लाघाद्भुत पुष्पवृष्टि लहरी सौगंध्य पाणिंधया. Ubhaya Bharati, goddess Saraswati herself, accepted the cogent arguments of Shankaracharya, that she accepted that Mandana was defeated, and her words, her verdict came like a shower of sweet-smelling flowers. Tashlaghat bhuta pushpa vrishti lahari saugandha panindhaya. And the verdict was a directive to her husband to take up sannyasa, to abandon home, to abandon her. There's a rather interesting long conversation that occurs between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra post-defeat. I'll quickly summarize it. Mandana tells Shankaracharya, I'm not unhappy about my personal defeat. It does not bother me, my ego, that I was defeated at your hands. But what does bother me is the fact that a great sage like Jaimini could be wrong. How is this possible? I cannot accept that such a giant of a scholar, such a giant of a saint, how could he be wrong? Hey Yatiraja, samprati mama abhinavat apajayat vishadam na praptosmi apitu jaiminiya vachanani unmathitani iti karanat atyantam krushosmi. To this Shankaracharya beautifully says, surely it is not that Purvamimamsa is wrong or false. It is simply that the object of inquiry for the Purvamimamsa and for the Vedanta is completely different. One is interested in dharma, the other in Brahman. The two areas are not even related to each other as Mukhya and Gauna goals. They are exclusively opposed to one another. The fruits of the two inquiries are different in that dharma is meant for fulfillment within the field of avidya, and brahmajnana is intended to cross over avidya. In his Sutra Bhashya, Shankaracharya says, Abhyudaya phalam dharmajnanam tachanusthana peksham nishreyasa phalam tu brahmavijnanam nachanusthana peksham. So in other words, one is for pravritti marga and the other is for nivritti marga. Both are valid and both are necessary. This is a very long conversation, a very important conversation, but I will not go into the details of it. Ultimately, Mandana is satisfied. He is happy to hear this and he praises Shankaracharya for his piercing insights. He takes refuge as his disciple. Tadaham visrijya sutadara graham द्रविणानि कर्म च गृहे विहितं शरणं वृणोमि भगवच्चरणात् मनुषाधि किंकरं मुं कृपया. Now Ubhaya Bharati challenges Shankaracharya. She says, Apitu tvayadya na samagrajitaha prathitagranir mama patir yadaham vapurardhamasya na jita matiman apimam vijitya kuru shishyamimam. You have not completely defeated Mandana until you have defeated me, his ardhangi. So before he becomes your disciple, in order that he becomes your disciple, you have to first defeat me in debate. Shankaracharya initially objects to this. He says, you're a woman and it's not gentlemanly, it is not civilized to fight a woman, whether in battle or in Shastra. But to this, Ubhaya Bharati says, it is irrelevant that I'm a woman. If your doctrine, your Siddhanta is challenged, then the gender of the challenger should not matter to you. Your duty is to uphold your Siddhanta, to protect it, to safeguard it. So do that, do your job. Swamatam prabhetum ihayo yatate sa vadhujanostu yadivastivat itaraha yatitavyameva khalu tasya jaye nijapaksha rakshana parair bhagavan. Further, she cites the example of the debates between Yajnavalkya and Gargi, between Janaka and Sulabha. She argues that the honor, the reputation of these great sages was in no way sullied by debating with women. So it's only fair that Shankaracharya accept the challenge of Ubhaya Bharati. Convinced, Shankaracharya accepts the challenge. The two sit down for the debate. This debate, it is said, was very well argued by both sides. Everyone who had gathered to witness it was left dumbfounded with wonder at their learning, at the sharpness of their logic, the soundness of their reasoning, the beauty of expression. Their performance was not less than that of Adishesha and Brihaspati. The details of the debate are not mentioned. It's only said that this protracted debate continued for 17 days and 17 nights. And the only breaks that were allowed were that for daily ablutions. At the end of 17 days, finding no other way to defeat Shankaracharya, Ubhaya Bharati decided to use her advantage as a wife, as a grihini, to defeat him. So, Yaminam Sadasyam Umapritchadasau Kusumastra Shastra Hridayam Vidushi Kalaha Kiyantyo Vadapushpadhanmanaha Kimatmikaha Kincha Padam Samashritaha Purve cha Pakshe Kathamanyatha Sthitaha Katham Yuvatyam Kathameva Purushe. Discuss with me the science and the art of lovemaking between a man and a woman. Kusumastra Shastra Hridayam Aprachat Vidushi. And here commences the story of how Shankaracharya requests a month's time to answer this question. And he travels to go find a body of a dead king, Amaru. Then Parakaya Pravesha, then he understands the art of lovemaking through that body, comes back to answer Ubhaya Bharati and defeats and her and wins this debate. This story is a rather literal understanding of the idea of sarvajñatva. It's not necessary. Sarvajñatva is not literal. I remember reading a discussion in the dialogues of the talks of Ramana Maharshi. So a disciple asks if Ramana Maharshi can do calculus, or if can he speak Spanish if he wishes to. Technically, he should be able to because he's a sarvajña. So this is the literal reading of it. So the Upanishadic statement that if you know Brahman, you know everything. So this is taken very literally and illustrated very literally here. It's a rather long story. I'll not go into the details of it. There are one or two very profound dialogues that occur in that context. But ultimately, the dialogue between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra is portrayed in a way that is not entirely fair to Mandana. Personally, I think Mandana Mishra is a very interesting figure in Indian intellectual history. He is held in great respect by both Purvamimamsakas and traditional Advaita Vedantins. He wrote both Mimamsa and Vedanta texts. He wrote a commentary on Kumarila's Tantra Vartika. He also wrote 3 independent treatises that deeply influenced the subsequent Indian philosophical tradition. 3 works, Vidhi Viveka, Bhava Viveka, and Mimamsa Anukramani. These are amongst the earliest monographs in Indian philosophical literature. Monograph means treatises that are dedicated to a single topic, not a commentary of a previous text. So these 3 texts are among the earliest monographs in Indian philosophical literature. His Brahma Siddhi is a text of Vedanta that deeply influenced and informed Padmapadacharya's interpretation of Shankara's works. So he was an intellectual giant. Furthermore, it is said that Mandana Mishra is this same Mandana who later became Sureshwaracharya. Sureshwaracharya is the name that he took post sannyasa. This is the claim. Of course, it is contested in academic circles. Scholars like M. Hiriyanna, Kuppuswamy Shastrigal, my own guru for that matter, held that this identity is impossible. Kuppuswamy Shastrigal, in fact, pointed out that Mandana, the word Mandana could be a title that was conferred upon very great scholars, a title of recognition, because of its catalogus catalogorum, it mentions several authors with this name, Mandana. So the identity of Mandana as Sureshwaracharya is at best a conjecture, not an impossible one, but an improbable one. Be that as it may, this debate is ultimately very interesting because of the fundamental issues that are addressed in it. The points that are raised are very valid. The way they have been countered is very nuanced. For a literary piece like this is not technically a work of abstract philosophy, so you cannot expect it to do complete justice to either positions, but it is largely based on the original works of Shankaracharya. So it makes for a very useful and a very interesting read. It would be admittedly better if Mandana's positions were also incorporated, fully fleshed out, and well argued. But, well, this is Shankara Vijaya, not Mandana Vijaya. So, with this, I'll conclude my talk. Thank you very much for listening to this. I request you to kindly subscribe to Atharva Forum for very fascinating talks on very fascinating topics. Namaste.